You cannot really, it seems to me, sum up Bill Buckley unless you concede that he really was the maker of a movement.
And proving that conservatives could compete. We could hit big league pitching on the intellectual level. And that's also why the left could never dismiss Buckley, right? No, he's too formidable for us to simply write off.
He was talking about creating a movement which would, in effect, create a new zeitgeist for conservative ideas.
I think there are 3 or 4 reasons for their deep friendship. I think they shared an important disposition that you could say encompassed both sides of the conservative political movement. There's an intellectual side, which was the ideas and policies, and then there's the political side, which is conservatives realized after World War II that conservatives needed to compete in the political arena more so than they had before. And they both understood that, and then they both also represented what used to be called fusionism, right? Which is, maybe one way of putting it is, both, you could say, channeled the best of Edmund Burke and Adam Smith. And that's a really key combination. I never liked the word fusionism very much, but it's an accurate one that, we've been using forever because we don't have anything better.
Yeah. Steve, I think you're exactly right. The combination of what I always call electoral politics and policy politics came together between these two guys. And I saw it up close when I happened very early on to read former Governor Reagan's copy of Friedrich von Hayek's Road to Serfdom with the Reagan notes in there. I mean, here's this politician who had already been governor of California who actually read Friedrich Hayek Road to Serfdom. And the fact that he was a charter subscriber to National Review doesn't surprise me at all, because he wanted to get that intellectual vibrancy really back. And as a fellow Midwesterner, I'm just so proud to call him a fellow Illini too.
Right.
Well, I think also that they were united in their hatred of communism. And this really was the glue, as George Nash put it, that kept together both the traditionalists and also the libertarians. And I think, looking back, there really was a severe Cold War going on. And Buckley and Reagan agreed that needed to be met. And as a matter of fact, of course, it was Ronald Reagan who finally said, well, I've got a very simple solution for the Cold War. We win, they lose.
Right.
So I think that the question of how do you stand with regard to the threat of communism was integral to their working together and I think building a movement.
I think there are 2 personal traits that are worth bringing up. One is they both had a great sense of humor. And in fact, I think one of the earliest exchanges in the 60s between Buckley and Reagan, maybe the first time they met, is when Reagan told Buckley that he'd enjoyed a joke Buckley had told at the expense of Eleanor Roosevelt in Up From Liberalism. That was, one of Buckley's first serious books. And he had some great barbs about Eleanor Roosevelt in that book. And Reagan liked those. Churchill used to say that only someone who can understand the humorous side of life can understand the most serious things. And I think that's true of both men. They had a similar sense of humor, loved to make a joke and break out a smile at the expense of liberals. By the way, I have to add as an editorial comment, liberals aren't very funny. I mean, has Bernie Sanders ever told a joke or cracked a smile in his life? That tends to be what they're like. But they had a joy for life, right? It was said that they both had a talent for happiness, an ability for friendship that wasn't limited by ideology. Reagan had friends all across the spectrum in Hollywood, of course, just as Buckley would go skiing with John Kenneth Galbraith. It's been mentioned that very different backgrounds. Buckley from a wealthy family, Reagan who grew up poor. Every once in a while you'll see an undertone of that come out. Reagan would write to Buckley saying, I don't understand why you want to go skiing in Switzerland. If you want snow, isn't Buffalo good enough?
Their coming together was, to my mind, interesting from my interaction with both of these men. Not only man to man, it was also wife to wife. I mean, both couples were really quite close. Yeah. And knowing both wives, of course, they were somewhat older than I was, but that was not easy, I don't think, because it was a tough kind of combination. But they all got along, all 4 of them. And the sense of humor that you mentioned, Steve, is so true. The notion, and even today we talk about Afghanistan, but the notion that when the Russians first invaded Afghanistan, one of Reagan's first promises to Bill Buckley, when and if I become president, I'm going to appoint you ambassador to Kabul. And that went on for years and years, back and forth. Incidentally, a couple days ago, I checked with one of the AI options on the internet, and I asked, what year was William Buckley ambassador to the United Nations? I got the immediate response that William Buckley was never ambassador to the United Nations. I corrected them, pointed out in 1973 as the public representative that Richard Nixon, in fact, had appointed him, and that he did a very good job there. And anyway, AI came back and apologized for not realizing that Buckley had ever been an ambassador, but there we are. Yeah.
I think there was, as you say, a very special relationship, familial relationship between them. And there was the one occasion when the Reagans and the Buckleys were in Barbados at the home of Colette Colbert. And they went swimming, the two men. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure what inspired him, but Bill said to Reagan, he said, well, would you like to get the National Review Medal of Freedom? Oh, well, how would I go about that? And Buckley said, well, I will pretend to drown. You will save me. And in exchange for that, you will get the National Review Medal of Freedom. And that's the way it worked out. Yeah. So Reagan was still rescuing all kinds of people into his 60s and 70s, not just as a lifeguard in
college, in high school, yeah,
right.
Back in Illinois.
You bring up an important point, Ed, about the friendship of the wives. Nancy Reagan often used Bill Buckley as someone to talk to when she was upset about things in the White House, constantly being assailed by the media and her enemies and so forth. And she would call up Bill for counsel and settle her nerves, you might say. So that was a close personal relationship, too.
And also it extended to the children. That Ron Jr., in writing to Bill Buckley on some occasions, said, "Dear Uncle Bill." So it was not just a casual thing. It really went deep, deep into wherein the junior thought he could talk in a very personal way, Uncle Bill, to get his advice about something. So I don't think you can see in American politics, right, Steve, any other kind of relationship like this between somebody inside and outside an administration.
Well, and move back to Bill's generation, of course, you had older brother Jim, who went on to have one of the highest ranking positions in the U.S. State Department, to head up Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and having already been a member of the second most important court in the United States, the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia, an extraordinary person himself, and a U.S. Senator from New York. He was an integral part of the Reagan team leadership, really, in so many different arenas there during his whole presidency. You know, like brother, I think, in that case, when you talk about Bill and Jim Buckley.
Well, Jim is the rare person who served at the highest levels of all three branches of government. There's almost no one else you can name that you can say that of. I think it should be said that just as Ronald Reagan was the ultimate breakthrough candidate for conservatism by winning the presidency, successor to Goldwater was the first important figure in that story, I think, politically. But at the end of the day, I've come to the conclusion that Buckley is the most important or most influential journalist and editor in American history. I mean, we usually say, well, Mark Twain's a bigger literary figure, but I think you can't find somebody who has the extensive portfolio of Reagan in founding a magazine, being a leader of a movement, spotting talent, nurturing organizations, and he comes along and reaches his zenith at exactly the time Reagan arrives on the scene. So that's, at this point, you almost have to say the hand of Providence has to be here somewhere.
I think you have to take a look at that and see the running for mayor of New York City was really a pivotal moment in the relationship. Because if you look and see at the movement before he ran for mayor of New York City, Bill was just one of a number of well-regarded writers, commentators, and so forth, maybe writing a few books, but he was not really a dominant figure. But with that running for mayor and what followed on that he became I think, the conservative intellectual, dominating in television, radio, syndicated newspapers, and novelists. Extraordinary man.
Yeah.
There's an important footnote to that mayor's race. Buckley ran strongest in the outer boroughs, in Queens and Staten Island, the working class parts. He thought he'd do best in Manhattan because people would vote for a guy who used big words and was cultured. That was the beginning of the understanding that then transferred to Reagan, and I think you can see it go all the way up to Trump today, that there's a vast audience out there for common sense conservatism. So people would listen to Buckley talk about crime, they'd say, yeah, this guy's right.
And as a matter of fact, Kevin Phillips wrote a book about that, The Emerging Republican Majority.
Yeah, yeah.
Looked at the fact that Buckley did so well in Queens and the other outer lying boroughs, and that was the beginning of reaching out that Reagan was able to do, and we see that in the Tea Party, and even a little bit of what's going on now. I think you can say that.
Yeah, very much so.
I think, too, you can observe that they were unique in being not just political figures, but they were both, I'll say it, policy wonks. Buckley was kind of a one-man think tank. So if you go back to a forgotten book of his, in 1970, which is before the Heritage Foundation was a glimmer in your eye, Ed,
That's right.
Buckley publishes this book called 4 Reforms, a Program for the 70s. And it was 4 specific reforms on crime, education, taxes, and I forget the 4th one now, welfare. And it read like a policy paper. Except with his flourishes and wit and narrative thrown into it. At the same time, Reagan comes into office, and of course he's conservative and he's got a lot of general themes, but he makes one of his earliest appearances on Firing Line when it was a brand new show, and he starts talking about things that today are very familiar to us, but then were kind of novel. He talks about how we've been centralizing government. We've been making the states administrative units of the national government. We need to revive the principles of the 10th Amendment and have devolution of the states. Oh, and he also added that, we now are ruled by bureaucrats who are unaccountable to the voters. He laid out a lot of the analysis that now is familiar to us as the administrative state in 1967. That's, I think, when Buckley liked him, but really took his measure as a serious person, someone who needed to be president. Because early on in the early 60s, when you first heard talk of Reagan running for office, reportedly Buckley was somewhat skeptical. Well, he's been a Hollywood actor. I'm not sure if this is a great idea. But at that point, he understood that this was the person for our movement.
Yeah. Well, back in those early days, too, if you look at the Reagan intellectual side, you had Reagan working for General Electric, who would think that would be of any importance intellectually or to the conservative movement, going from city to city into General Electric factories, always by train because he didn't like to fly, and doing things like reading Hayek and Milton Friedman and National Review on those train rides and developing his own intellectual depth that eventually led him to such great success politically.
And Lee, you should say more about the GE years, which I think are crucial, and I think you know better than I do.
Well, in 1954 is when Reagan took over as running the GE Theater on Sunday night, a half-hour series. And up until that point, he had been a liberal Democrat, had been shifting towards the right, but not really gone over. We know, for example, back in 1958, when there was a rally for Harry Truman in Hollywood, there was Ronald Reagan as the master of ceremonies for Harry Truman running for re-election in 48 and winning, as a matter of fact. But both Lemuel Bulwer, who was a ranking gentleman in General Electric, began giving magazines and books to Ronald Reagan for these long extended train trips that we're talking about. And if you talk, as I had a chance to talk to some of the GE people who were with him during this period, you could see him getting deeper and deeper, more and more focused on a particular program, might be welfare, might be enterprise zones and so forth. You could see them beginning to evolve. And so a period of 8 years, he was on the road from 54 to 62, meeting with also not just the top brass in a GE factory, but the people on the floor, talking with them, absorbing from that, well, what are you guys concerned about? So what a wonderful way of sort of taking the pulse of the nation that he was able to do for some 8 years, preparing him for finally running for governor.
And then you contrast that with WFB sitting with Bill Rusher and Wilmore Kendall and Frank Meyer, former communists, of course, now on our side, both in the international sphere, but also across the line. And what different perspectives they all bring together. And then kind of Barry Goldwater kind of makes it all kind of come together, because they both say, hey, this is our chance. Here's a real conservative who might actually become president of the United States. And as our old friend Bill Middendorf said in his volume, we could call the Goldwater year the glorious defeat, because yes, he lost, but boy, what that did in terms
Right.
of bringing them together and bringing the whole conservative movement together that's been so critical. Reagan with his speech, Buckley with his enthusiastic support of Goldwater, and all of it kind of coming together at one time.
Ed, I think you've touched on a really important thing if you want to understand what these two men were all about. And you used the term, I think, already once, Steve. They were both fusionists. And not only fusionists, but I would call them master fusionists. They were able to reach out, as Bill did, and bring in a Frank Meyer and a Russell Kirk, a traditionalist conservative and a radical libertarian, and put them on the same masthead and somehow keep them from not throwing stones and rocks and maybe bombs at each other. He was a master diplomat along with his fusionism. And I think that was a quality, of course, which Ronald Reagan had. And Ed, you've talked about this, about politics being addition and not subtraction. I think that both of these men knew that, and were trying to figure out what is going to be the glue to keep us together. And of course, that was communism.
And thinking that through further, I mean, that, as you rightly pointed out already, Lee, that Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, we win, they lose, this kind of thing, much more simplistic, shall we say, than what a Bill Buckley argument would sound like, even on firing line, but kind of a summary for all the people that they were both trying to reach in the United States from their very different perspectives. I mean, Buckley, National Review, in its glory days, 100,000 circulation in print copies, and those 100,000 people really mattered because at the height of the Reagan era, that was everybody who had kind of an inkling that, hey, this guy is important and we ought to know what he knows, and we ought to be aware of what's going on with him. But when you talk about, again, he had from his GE days the baseline where when a young Turk comes along like Jack Kemp and talks about supply-side economics, in 1978 and 79, boy, that becomes Reagan's tax bill, and there it is, and that's all been coming up really through NR and through that incredible relationship that the two of them had.
I think that, as you say, I recall there was one broadcast which he did back in the 60s. It was the National Security Council, NSC 68, was published. And this was a 70-page document sort of laying out U.S. national security and foreign policy for the next several years. He was doing his radio program at this point, a 3-minute commentary, and he took that report, mostly edited and written by Paul Nitze, and reduced it down to 2 3-minute commentaries. I mean, that's pretty good going. And to be able to do that, and here was an alleged Hollywood actor, which was always something which didn't make much carry much weight. It really didn't.
Right. Well, maybe that's an important, not distinction as so much, but Buckley's, you might say, Rococo writing style. I'll put it that way, which I always enjoyed immensely. I learned writing from reading National Review, using Latin phrases a lot. That's not really writing for the masses. But what Ronald Reagan would take it and he'd say, I know how to communicate. This is why we called him the great communicator, right? I can take those ideas, I can reformulate them and explain them in a way that will reach the masses and persuade them, right? So that was a nice partnership that way. I'm sure Buckley understood that. He knew that he was writing chiefly for elites and for intellectuals and proving that conservatives could compete. We could hit big league pitching on the intellectual level. And that's also why the left could never dismiss Buckley, right? No, he's too formidable for us to simply write off. They called him names, they called him a fascist and all the rest of that, but we're used to that by now. Again, two sides of a partnership that made the two of them such an effective force.
Talk with me about the Panama Canal, the big debate in 1978. I mean, and they're my two heroes, the intellectual hero, Buckley, the political hero, Ronald Reagan, and Buckley saying, yeah, we should give up the Panama Canal. My God, That's one of the pride and joys of American technology and American presence in the world. Why?
Right, and not just Buckley himself, but along with James Burnham and George Will, who you don't think of as soft-headed, soft-minded people.
No.
That was such a burning issue of the day. I remember it so well that people were almost coming to fisticuffs over this.
Even within the conservative movement.
Within the conservative movement. And this, you could not choose a more controversial subject in which you would say, well, of course, there's only one obvious answer here, and that would be against the treaties and turning them over to this guy, Torrijos. We can't have that happen. This is going to affect national security, not just economic travels through the canal, but our national security for Central America. And yet here was Buckley making a very calm, cool, rational argument saying, now politically though, wouldn't this improve our reputation, not only in Central America, but all of Latin America, if we were to make it and concede this point of letting Torrijos with our involvement, because it was not just a question of having no hands at all on it. There still would be a role for U.S. might to be there to guarantee it. But Buckley, I wonder whether he always was doing it just to be a little extra provocative and taking this different position.
Well, I think that was one of those debates that's actually emblematic of a strength of the conservative movement, which is we do have these debates amongst ourselves. Can you imagine liberals having a debate on the Panama Canal Treaty or anything like that? They have one point of view and that's it. There really isn't any debate. We do have those kinds of debates. Now, I was then and still remain, whatever Buckley says goes for me. I'm almost there. I do think this is one case where Reagan got the better of him. And my small focus group on this was my own parents, who were Goldwater Reagan Republicans in California. And they watched it. I was at college at the time, I think, but I watched it and they said, oh, we think Reagan killed Buckley. Really, I would have called it a draw if I was scoring it, maybe, to be fair. But I think they might have been right about that. I think Reagan got the better of the argument for one reason that I think escaped Buckley's attention. Think of them when that was happening. It was just a few years after our humiliation in Vietnam. The morale of the country was very low. The 70s were a dismal decade. Jimmy Carter was president, giving away the store. And now you want to give the canal away? It was not a good time. And Buckley acknowledged that argument, but sort of dismissed it as being unserious, which I think was an error on his part. Now, of course, if you play the sequel out, it's kind of interesting. I mean, one of Reagan's point was, you're giving it away to a dictator who has threatened us with violence if we don't do it. And by the way, remember, Reagan never said absolute no. He said, we can have negotiations, and he had alternatives, as Reagan always did. Let's have an international body that we lead, but includes Latin American participation. He was not against all change, just as Burke wasn't, as we know. Now fast forward 10 years to when Reagan is president. Torrijos is gone, but now there's Noriega, a dictator implicated clearly in the drug trade, who our national security apparatus asked Reagan to plan to invade Panama to remove him from office. And Reagan said, no, I don't want to do that. Partly that was his aversion to force, which we can say more about in the area of nuclear weapons. But partly Reagan wrote in his diary and told some friends at the time privately that I think America has had too big a foot in intervening in Central America. And he finally said, I'll leave it to George, meaning George Bush, to take care of if he wants to, but I don't want to order the invasion of Panama. And then some years after that, when Panama's in chaos, I heard liberals say, gosh, maybe Reagan was right after all, that we should have kept the canal. So it's funny how these things take a circuitous route.
But I have to talk a little bit about the I'm sure you guys remember it, the 76 primary battle going on between President Jerry Ford and the challenger Ronald Reagan. And it came down to North Carolina. And Reagan, challenging Ford, the incumbent, had been defeated in every single primary leading up to North Carolina. The conservative forces led by Jesse Helms said to Reagan, you've got to take a strong position on this and really go after Jerry Ford about giving up on the Panama Canal, which he did, and guess what happened? Reagan won in a big upset the North Carolina primary. If he had not won that, he might very well have withdrawn and not continued challenging him. And that would have had an impact upon his deciding whether to run or not for president. Let it be. So that issue resonated so many ways and so many times. It's one that I think, as you say, Steve, Reagan came out on the right side. The Panama Canal, which was this emotional issue that it had the conservative movement on fire, saying, no, we must not give up the Panama Canal. Of course came the famous debate between Buckley and Reagan, with Reagan against the treaties, Buckley for them. And I think that Reagan, who was, they go around bragging about himself, thought he did a pretty good job. And so he thought to himself, oh, I'm going to invite them to dinner And we'll talk a little bit about this and that, but I'm sure about the Panama Canal. So he wrote a little note to, "Dear Bill, please slow down as you approach the house tonight for dinner," or the next night. Bill is there with Pat, does that, and all of a sudden there are 3 placards which greet him as he goes through the driveway leading up to the GE home that they lived in at the time. "We bought it. We built it. It's ours."
So throw back to the
rub it in.
throw back to the old Burma shave signs of our youth, right?
Exactly.
There we are.
Exactly.
You know, when I think about the relationship between the two men and their roles in the conservative movement, one of the unifying things that comes to my mind is they both believed in independent conservative institutions, and they wanted to build them up. Whether it was Bill Buckley and the Sharon Statement that launches Young Americans for Freedom at his home in Sharon, Connecticut, whether it was his original presidency at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, his founding role in the Philadelphia Society to bring conservative intellectuals together, and so many other institutions. And Ronald Reagan, similarly, when he's in office and before he's in office, coming to CPAC year after year, which brought so many conservatives from around the country together, and saying, hey, this movement is more than just individuals, it's also building up these permanent institutions that'll be around, we hope, for generations after. And they both expressed that various times at some of our heritage events, and it was always such a thrill to me to hear them say, hey, this is really important, what people are doing. Yes, it's good to subscribe to National Review, but also support independent think tanks, whether it's a state think tank in your own state capital, or whether it's a national group like a Heritage or some of the others around. It was very, very encouraging to me in terms of how you bring people together. And Lee, my favorite saying, add and multiply. Don't subtract and divide if you want to be successful, either on the policy side or the electoral side. Add and multiply.
And I think you've touched upon a key point, and that is you cannot really, it seems to me, sum up Bill Buckley unless you concede that he really was the maker of a movement. And I recall in doing some research early on him that he referred to National Review, not yet appearing, as a formative journal. And his model was the New Republic, in which he said, I want to be able to change the climate change here, a different climate, to change the intellectual climate so that conservative ideas will be able to be treated in the same respect. And the fact that the New Republic, of course, laid the groundwork for FDR and the New Deal on those years leading up to it. And so that the bill was not just talking about a magazine. It was talking about creating a movement which would, in effect, create a new zeitgeist for conservative ideas.
Well, he was a great talent spotter at the magazine. I mean, everyone knows, of course, of the sort of famous people he recruited, like Whittaker Chambers and James Burnham and Frank Meyer and so forth. He also gave a start to some people who went on to be more prominent as liberal writers, like Joan Didion, John Leonard, Gary Wills, most famously.
Yes, right.
Wills never mentions his National Review heritage anymore.
Days.
But,
No.
And that's partly because Buckley wanted people who were interesting and talented. And I think they did pick up some things from Buckley, even if they wouldn't admit it in later years. But there's another element, in addition to helping organizations and founding the Philadelphia Society and so forth. It has never gotten much attention, and mostly because it was done quietly. But Bill was kind of a one-man foundation. Through National Review, I've just had little scraps of this over the years, and I don't have a complete picture, but I think it's larger than anyone knows. But you would find out that he had helped support an author in writing a book. He helped sponsor a trip for someone to do research overseas. I know in one case he actually paid for Harry Jaffa to come to his son's graduation from Yale because Harry was broke. So little acts of charity like that, which I think he routed through National Review because as a nonprofit he could do that. And as I say, I don't think anyone's ever put that together, and I think he did that on a very large scale, very quietly and modestly.
I ran across 2 examples. It's a terrific area in which we need to talk more about. Bill's charity was extraordinary. Ernest Vandenhoeg, who was a writer for National Review, was told by his doctor, Ernest, you're getting too fat. You're not exercising enough. I want you to get out there and do more physical labor. And Ernest revealed this to Bill and thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I think something like 2 days later, 3 days later, this great big package arrived at Vandenhoeg's apartment, and he was ripping it off, and it was a treadmill from Bill Buckley. And he said, put that thing to work. Another example of his extraordinary thinking about people whom he loved and respected was Gertrude Vogt, who was his secretary for a number of years. She retired, went to San Francisco, beautiful town, beautiful city, but of course filled with big hills that you have to climb up at. What could he do? What could Bill do for Gertrude? And it turned out to be that he had a permanent place with yellow cabs. She didn't have to climb up the hills. She could take a taxi and get from place to place for the rest of, well, forever. Another example of his thinking, how can I possibly do something that's going to make a difference in the lives of somebody whom I love and respect.
The other side of that, I think, going back to a point we've all kind of hinted at, was, I'll never forget, he had retired as editor-in-chief, so he was now senior editor, but he still sent out the annual fundraising letter. And at this stage of the game, I guess it's, early 2000s, maybe late 1990s, I got the fundraising letter. I thought, man, this is vintage Buckley. And I said to Linda, we're going to up it a little bit this year. So I sent him $500 to National Review, which, we had 2 kids in college, and this was a lot of money. I got the nicest letter back from him. And he started out, he said, I knew it. They said when I stepped down that the whole thing was going to fall apart, but now you've done it, you've proven that it's going to continue. And he goes on and he says, and George Will says that National Review is the most important magazine of the 20th century, so you can now say legitimately that you are a financier of the most important intellectual journal of the 20th century. I mean, I'm sure my $500 didn't do that much, but it was that kind of enthusiasm that he could convey to somebody. Very special moment and a special letter from him. Yeah.
One of the ironies of National Review at its founding, which a lot of people observed, was there were so many ex-communists amongst its writers. Whittaker Chambers, Willie Schlamm, some names forgotten like Schlamm, James Burnham, Frank Meyer. Wilmer Kendall had been a communist as a young man, right? And I think one of the things that they brought, in addition to a clarity about the Cold War, was they understood that leftist ideology was as much about power, or more about power, than it was about ideas. And that's why it was important to engage the wider world as in a deliberately political way. I think, you may not agree with me about either one of you about this, but I think that the conservative movement before that era after World War II was kind of apolitical or even anti-political. And Buckley's kind of an interesting example of this. It's well known that one of his influences personally was Albert J. Nock. Wonderful writer, sort of an anarcho-libertarian, but hated politics, hated politicians, didn't vote. He was one of those above it all or just indifferent kinds of persons. That's not a formula for success in the world. That is to surrender the political world to our enemies on the left. And the people who really understood it in their bones were all those ex-communists. Yeah. I think of all of them, the most important was James Burnham. They're all, I think, very interesting people. But you think of Burnham has 2 works that hold up today better than ever. The Managerial Revolution, and he was still slightly on the left, maybe still a little bit, but that's a description of what today we call the administrative state. And then, of course, his classic from the 60s, Suicide of the West, which is all about the perversity of liberal ideology. That book is not dated a bit, here 60 years later. And then beyond that field, I think that drew in a lot of younger conservatives to realize, oh yes, we not only have to be about principles and philosophy, but we also have to engage the political world and compete in our political system.
Yeah. I guess the only exception, I would say Frank Meyer was probably pretty close to Kendall in terms of importance, et cetera, because of what he did, not only National Review in terms of being the book editor for so many decades, but also in terms of then kind of, I don't know if he was actually assigned by Buckley or not to say, hey, this fusionism stuff, you ought to be Mr. Fusion, and by gosh, that's what Frank Meyer became. And he talked about bringing libertarians in. Those of us who were kind of very proudly Russell Kirk, Ernest von Kuhnelt-Ledeen kind of traditional conservatives wouldn't have much to do with libertarians. And, Milton Friedman, well, yeah, he's a good economist, but he's kind of out of the matrix. Well, by gosh, let's bring them all in. And that was Meyer, and he did it so effectively. And that was one of those big additions, I think, in terms of where we are still today. and still having some little, shall we say, differentials between the Tea Party part of the movement, the new right versus the brand new right versus the whatever the next week's right is going to be, and how it all comes together. And Lee, you've been around seeing it for far longer than any of us.
Well, I have to respectfully disagree with both of you. I would say that the most important person whom we brought on board was Whittaker Chambers. I think that Whittaker Chambers was at the crux of one of the most important issues of that period, one might even say of that half century, and that was the Alger Hiss Whittaker Chambers. First congressional testimony, and then the two legal battles in New York City. Bill, in referring to Whittaker Chambers, said that he was the most significant defector from communism in that century. And I think, therefore, one can make a good case, and which I'm trying to make here, is that the influence both on Bill, on the magazine, and particularly on the movement, it was absolutely essential that Whittaker Chambers prevail over Alger Hiss. Without it, the movement, and I think the country, would have been so far different than what it actually turned out to be.
Wow, you're absolutely right. I mean, Whittaker Chambers' letter to my children in the opening paragraphs of Witness, his incredible autobiography. What does all this have to do, though, when you get down to Buckley and Reagan? I mean, why is this, Steve?
Well,
you've written a monumental biography of Ronald Reagan. How does this fit in?
Well, Ed, you mentioned that we have all these factions today, right? And those factions, a lot of them existed in earlier forms then. What held them together, I think, in both cases, is this force of personality. Reagan, I think, Lee, you said he was a diplomat. I mean, that's accurate. There's even more than that. There was something about his magnetic personality that could harmonize a gear-drive economist like Milton Friedman and a cape-wearing aristocrat like Eric von Kuehne-Ledeen. I mean, they don't fit together, except around Buckley they fit together. He's like one of those unstable atoms that suddenly, when he's the nucleus, it becomes stable, or an element, right? Reagan was a similar way, I think, right? And libertarians liked him for the most part, and traditional, everybody liked him. He liked all of them. Again, it's that friendliness at a certain level. There's a dispositional element there that's hard to, define in precise intellectual terms, hard to imitate. And again, the coincidence of those two people with those magnetic personalities that could reach across the spectrum, that was the secret sauce of the conservative movement.
But isn't the key that they both agreed that communism was the outstanding primary threat to America's existence, and therefore must put aside our differences as libertarian and traditionalists and unite against this common enemy, which was the Soviet Union abroad and, of course, a Leviathan state here at home.
I'm glad you had that last part, Lee, because I think it's important that, I always say Reagan had a unifying principle of both domestic policy and foreign policy. By the way, you will notice the mischief that goes on from the left today about Reagan. They'll say, well, the Cold War ended well, and he played a good part in it, but his domestic policy was terrible, and it was different. And say, no, if you pay close attention to Reagan, he would attack communism abroad and big government at home.
Right.
And the famous Westminster speech in 1982 in London, there's the sentence in there, I don't quite have it memorized exactly, but he says, there's a threat in the modern world from tyrannical regimes and big government. This part, remember, secret police, mindless bureaucracy, all conspiring against human freedom. So secret police is the leading feature of totalitarian communist tyrannies. Mindless bureaucracy is the leading feature of our government, right? So in other words, there was a unity in his mind. Now, it might not be as terrible and tyrannical in terms of violence at home, but it was no less a serious problem for him. And that's the unity of Reagan's statecraft.
Buckley said something like, if I had to make a choice as to who is my primary enemy, the bureaucracy that's trying to bury me or the bureaucracy that's trying to bankrupt me, I will go with the first. And that is primary more of a concern.
Right.
So it really, communism, I agree with you about Leviathan. It's becoming larger and larger and larger every year. But I think he would say that Moscow was number one enemy.
But here's an important point, though, Lee. Of course, you mentioned Whittaker Chambers. And he famously said, when I left the Communist Party, I thought I was leaving the winning side to join the losing side. He was a pessimist about it. So were a lot of conservatives and neoconservatives were pessimistic about it. Who wasn't? Well, Reagan wasn't, as we know. And I think Buckley wasn't also. Here and there you can see direct statements and writings of his where he said, eventually we're going to win. I don't know how, but we're going to win, and we're going to look back on people like Reagan as being important in bringing that about.
Right.
Yeah, and certainly a skepticism toward some of the later, shall we say, foreign entanglements of the 21st century.
Right.
Where Reagan was not around to comment on it, but Buckley was certainly somewhat aghast at some of George W.'s international encounters, shall we say.
Because he said that was nation building, and that's not conservative.
One thing you can say about Buckley that made him unusual and stand out is that he was the first celebrity conservative. I think his first cover of Time magazine or Newsweek, or maybe both, was around 1967. And he was on TV a lot. He would go on Johnny Carson repeatedly. And who else does things like that? Well, Hollywood stars. So Reagan was used to being on the cover of magazines as an actor and in the tabloids and so forth. And his TV show, Firing Line, what was the talk about? The set was minimalist. There was no high production values. It did very high ratings for 30 years on Firing Line. In a format today that I think young kids, I've shown it to students, and they say, well, this is really slow and boring. But there was nothing like it at the time, and it was serious, and you'd see Buckley's wit.
Yeah, you paid attention, and for those 33 years, the longest running single hosted TV program of its kind in the history, and on public television, of all things, with not exactly either Ronald Reagan or Bill Buckley's favorite outlet, but there we were.
And I can't think of another journalist of any place on the spectrum for whom they would get lampooned on late night comedy shows. Like Saturday Night Live would make fun of Buckley. Laugh-In. He went on Laugh-In once. And he was a common target on Laugh-In, a show that people today have never heard of. Younger people haven't. But I think even the Second City Television out of Chicago, they had a Buckley imitator who was very good. So that's an amazing thing. And by the way, that's going to make a lot of people who are not necessarily ideological or say, maybe I should pay attention to what this person says. So it extended his reach, and I think he knew that, and that was on purpose.
Well, I think you've also touched upon something there that maybe needs to be explored, and that is that they had so much in common. They both were tall, and as a short guy, I'm impressed by that. Both were tall, both were charismatic, both were rather good-looking, both had an ease about them and a charisma about them. So I think that they both were coming out, in a sense, sort of reflecting Hollywood on the one hand and maybe, I don't know, New York City on the other hand. Sort of a cultural combination there of these two men. And I think it was very natural, in a sense, for them. This reinforced their friendship. They both had a confidence about each other.
Able to relate to each other at that level without even talking about it. I dare say that's not a common commentary when they're in black tie at a black tie dinner somewhere. It was very, very, very true. Yeah. Great.
I mean, there was a time when, as I mentioned earlier, they went vacationing together in Barbados. They played touch football one Thanksgiving. And as a matter of fact, that was the occasion on which Reagan, who was then pushing 70, held his own with Chris Buckley. And Buckley wrote a column about it, saying that, well, he looked to me pretty good, for a guy who was almost 70 years old. I think he can handle running for president of the United States.
Buckley and Reagan were both sponges in a lot of ways. They were very eclectic in their reading. They could, read a libertarian, a traditionalist, a neoconservative, and be persuaded by their arguments and realize how it might be useful and translate it to their own purposes. So that they're both sort of big tent conservatives that way. They're both very good at it.
Yes.
And Reagan didn't always talk about his reading habits for a bunch of reasons, but he did remember those people. And in particular, he did give the Presidential Medal of Freedom to James Burnham and posthumously to Whittaker Chambers. I think that shows the cast of his mind. So Buckley was famous for his big words, and I used to, in high school, I would use his words for my high school English vocabulary tests, and the teacher would get after me because, no, we've given you these other words, that's the standard ones. Where are you getting these? And I'd say National Review. And so, oh boy. But one of my favorites, we were handed tergiversation. I've always liked that one. I've used that one a lot. Deviating from orthodoxy, being a heretic.
Yes.
It's the whole thing here.
We're
That's
all-
one. And
yeah.
Oleaginous. Stan Evans liked to use that term. Oleaginous. I'm not sure even how to pronounce it. I'm not sure I can spell it myself.
Well, this is precisely why when I was once invited to be on firing line, I was absolutely terrified that he might use one of these words. But he was a man of such good charity. He could see my extreme disquiet and apprehension, and so he therefore did not use one of these words, taking pity on me.
But it was always a challenge to read his column in every National Review or to read it a couple times a week in the local newspaper. And oh wow, I better look that one up.
You had to have a dictionary
Came
hand,
my
right.
Webster. You know,
Right.
it was a lot harder back those days than it is nowadays.
Right.
Yeah.
I think today's editors would object to that, but I'm glad he did it. It made him fun.